Good morning to everyone, and a especially warm welcome to Professor Böhringer. It's an honor to have you here, Christoph. And we hope you will have a moment to take in the sights of Barcelona while you are with us. Thanks to all thank you all of you for coming to our 7th Symposium. The focus of this year's Symposium is smart energy systems from a new energy approach. Digitalization is transforming the energy sector, and one of the bigger challenges that the sector is facing is to understand how these new technologies, such as the Internet of the Things, big data, the cloud, cybersecurity, and so on, are profoundly impacting all aspects of the energy model. This is an extremely important challenge to the sector. This new technological era encompasses the deployment of digital frameworks in the whole energy system. A new wave of smart grids and meters is coming. Digitalization involves change in energy infrastructures and markets too, which include platforms for direct digital production and consumption, and platforms for interaction within two-sided markets. Advances in big data management and growing cloud capabilities, coupled with the acceleration in analytics and machine learning, have the potential to transform the way societies produce, buy, and sell electricity. The massive volumes of data coming from these new analytical tools will help us understand new customer behaviors and preferences, which are key elements of the European energy policy. To sum up, digitalization of the power sector is real, and it's happening now. Digitalization creates new opportunities, at the same time creates some risks that all agents, companies, consumers, regulators, and policymakers must face. To advance through such uncertainty, a clearer understanding is needed of what digitalization means for the energy sector, to better prepare and manage the inevitable changes it will bring. Today, our 7th Symposium will try to debate and answer some of the questions about the role by digitalization now and in the future for the energy sector, its implications and challenges from a new energy policy approach. These questions I have raised here will be addressed by our illustrious chairs today. Thank you very much for joining us. The strict selection of the papers present us with cutting-edge ideas on these topics, and our prestigious chairs will guide the debate and conclusions. The economic analysis of energy systems where new technologies have a central role, will be discussed by the first table. So smart technologies transforming the energy market, shared by Nestor Duke from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission, will analyze the importance of system actors and customer behaviors and experiences. These special topics in the context of demand response and smart technology will be analyzed in the paper presented by Sarah Darby from Oxford University, with the focus placed on climate change. Maria Loureiro from the University of Santiago de Compostela gives a novel contribution using big data. She compares and analyzes the results from state preference surveys and unsolicited Twitter conversations in US and Spain. And Patricia Pereira from the University of Coimbra analyzes one of the key elements in the transition to a clean energy future, smart grids. She assesses how market and regulatory factors drive stakeholders' decisions to invest in a smart grid technology in Europe. Flexibility from the demand side is the topic we are going to discuss in the second table, shared by Professor Monica Giulietti. The papers explore the link between smart technologies and energy markets within the context of energy transition to a low-carbon economy. One key question of the literature is to know what behavioral considerations affect customer reactions beyond the massive deployment of smart meters. Joan Batalla from Barcelona University will present the main conclusions of a range of empirical approaches taken on the behavior of consumers of electricity, focusing attention on those aspects that go beyond technological deployment. Annette Boom of Copenhagen Business School takes a theoretical approach to how the introduction of real-time metering and pricing will benefit consumers, producers, and overall welfare. And Sandra Kretschmer from Frederick Alexander University sheds light on energy storage adoption decisions at the household level. And the third table deals with an analysis of the type of energy policy required by a smart electricity system. Professor Andreas Loscher, chair of this session. Daniel Davy from Barcelona University analyzes how the location of different technologies explains energy flows and if congestion in transmission follows locational patterns, and proposes some revision of regulatory measures. The estimation of the rebound effect from PV installations with the net metering within generously support schemes is presented by Axel Gauthier from the University of Liège. André Pereira from University of Beira Interior addresses the change that must occur in supply and demand to allow a higher penetration of renewables and consequently increase diversification and diminish CO2 emissions to identify energy policy opportunities to improve the energy transition. And finally, Román Collado from Sevilla University studies how to detect anomalies when determining electricity price in the market and provides a useful tool to supervisory authorities that allows for the identification of periods of potentially irregular behavior of the agents. Finally, I would like to express my gratitude to keynote speakers, Professors Christoph Böhringer and Juan Rosellón. Juan will be in charge of the closing session. So, our day begins with one of the greatest authorities in the field. Let me introduce Professor Böhringer. I am delighted and honored to welcome you back, this time as keynote speaker. Before starting with his presentation titled "Do Smart Energy Systems Call for Smarter Energy Policies?", just allow me some words to present his distinguished academic career. Professor Böhringer is very well known for his work in the area of energy and environment. From 2007 onward, he has held the chair for economic policy at the University of Oldenburg. Until 2007, he was head of the CEW Leibniz Center for European Economic Research in Mannheim at the Research Department, Environmental and Resource Economics, Environmental Management. And from 2004 to 2007, he was appointed as a full professor at University of Heidelberg. His current research focuses on the analysis of an environmental, energy, and trade policies. Professor Böhringer has published in more than 100 peer-reviewed international top journals, for instance, in energy economics, climate policy, ecological economics, environmental and resource economics, the Energy Journal, European Journal of Political Economy, and so on. With his contribution, Professor Böhringer has reached more than 2,600 citations and has become a reference in the area of energy economics and environmental economics, being among the top 5% authors in the number of works, distinct works, citations, and age and index. Christoph, we are very happy to have you with us again. And also, let me to say, we now, and we like to express our sincere thanks for the big efforts you made to be present in this symposium. Professor Böhringer, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Michael, and the organizers for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure for me to give this presentation, and I try to follow the two key guidelines for keynote speeches, which is avoid, as far as possible, any equation and only present big numbers. So I think you can relax, and I hope it's somehow an easy start into the morning and into this symposium. The question to be discussed is the title: Do smart energy systems call for smarter energy policies? And the short answer to that question is yes. Energy policy must provide smarter regulation to drive energy system transformation through what we call the 3Ds of the energy future: decarbonization, decentralization, and digitalization. The first D, decarbonization, is the main driving force of the future energy system and refers to the threat of climate change. It more or less boils down to the necessity for fully decarbonizing the energy system over the next decades. Decarbonization based on renewable energy then leads to the second D, and the second D would be decentralization. So the future energy system will be much more distributed, much more interconnected, and it will be closer to the point of the use. And then third, we have digitalization, which basically offers a way to establish or organize an infrastructure for a more flexible and responsive energy system based on smart digital technologies and business models, such as smart grids, smart homes, smart metering, or automated blockchain trading. So you might not be really surprised on this short answer. I expect most of you are experts and know about the 3Ds. But as usual, the devil is more in the detail, and that, as Maite explained, is the background for this conference with all the presentations which are yet forthcoming. So I have organized my speech in 3 sections. I start with an initial sketch of the future energy system based on decentralized volatile energy sources, mostly wind and solar. Then I refer to the transformative power of digitalization, where new technologies and business models have a potential of what you call, in fancy terms, game changers for the energy business. And third, when I come back to the main question for economic regulation, which is what are the guidelines, what are basic guidelines to achieve decarbonization of the energy system in a cost-effective manner. And I then address also this issue of smarter regulation, where I want to point out that digitalization could facilitate even smarter regulation when being smart via the reduction of transaction cost and information asymmetries. So I have to apologize because we start with one equation, which is actually rather an identity, but that's the only one, so it should not be too much. So if we come to the first D, decarbonization, and we ask ourselves how could that be achieved, we have this variation of the so-called IPAT equation, IPAT impact equals population affluence technology, by a colleague Kaya in the 90s. And it simply shows the different challenges and channels for decarbonization. So we could think about reducing population. We could think about reducing GDP per capita, affluence. We could think about more technology-oriented options. One would be to think on energy intensity or carbon intensity. Energy intensity then means that we reduce energy as a percent of GDP, and that can be captured as energy efficiency improvements or energy savings. And the other channel would be carbon intensity, reduce carbon energy as a percent of total energy. We can think here on 2 sub-channels. One would be to actually reduce carbon intensity of fossil energy, where we simply do fossil fuel switching, so we come from coal and we go to gas, or we could use end-of-the-pipe technologies to decarbonize, like carbon capture and storage or sequestration. Then the other sub-channel would be to reduce fossil share in energy, which we could do by nuclear energy, if that's still a feasible option, or what most people think about would be an expansion of renewable energy, by solar, wind, hydro, biomass, and other renewable sources. If we then take a second glance, these various options boil down to what I would call real options or realistic options for decarbonization. So we would not really think about birth control or killing our economic performance by reducing GDP per capita. So we stay with the energy intensity channel. So it's basically energy efficiency improvements and energy savings. And pending on the policy environment, then along the carbon intensity dimension, there might be not so many options. If we think about a total decarbonization, gas is still a problem, and the society might not be open for carbon capture sequestration. If we think about going to non-fossil fuels, then the nuclear option might not be really viable. If I think about Germany, we have a nuclear phase-out. Meanwhile, we have also a coal phase-out. And so the only channel, in addition to energy efficiency and energy savings, is expanding on renewable energy. Mostly solar and wind, because in many countries, hydro is basically at the upper limit, and biomass is somehow disputed because of the whole environmental impacts. On closer inspection, meaning we look about the sources of emissions, it also becomes clear that just expanding renewable energy in electricity generation, something which is referred to as RES-E, renewable energy sources in electricity, will not do the job. So if you look at this cake here, we see that in the EU average, only roughly a fourth of greenhouse gas emissions stem from the power generation, and 3/3, 75% or more, come from other sectors, most importantly industry, buildings, and transport. So decarbonization, more or less, implies that we go to a green electrification of the whole energy system, which is called sector coupling. And this sector coupling via electrification can take place in two ways. It can be a direct manner or an indirect manner, and you see that in this fancy graph to the right. So take direct electrification. So you look at these solar panels and the wind power, the wind wheels on the top, and you see this arrow power to mobility, that you could use electricity actually to charge your batteries in cars. You could also take the electricity, you go to the other side in terms of power to heat, and you replace oil or gas boilers in households with heat pumps. Equivalent, you could think about indirect ways where you use the electricity, and in an intermediate step you first produce gas, say hydrogen, and if you follow the power to gas arrow here, then you use the hydrogen to fuel, basically, fuel cells in electrical vehicles. So that somehow, in a nutshell, could be the future of the energy system. And we could refer that in George Orwell terms as the brave new energy world, brave green energy world, if not considering challenges of such an energy transition. And the challenges mostly resides in the volatility and the decentralized nature of renewable energy sources. And because of these characteristics, it's clear that we need a massive expansion in transmission and distribution grid. We need to have incentives for building up reserve capacities, and in addition, we need lots of flexibility options, for example, storage, to actually secure energy supply. Green electrification via massive expansion of renewables will also not do the job. And I have prepared a little back on the envelope calculation to the upper right for Germany again. So Germany at the moment, say 2017, 2 years ago, but there's little change, had an end energy use of 2,591 terawatt hours, so the promised big number. And if you assume an average operation time of wind or solar with renewable energies of 1,800 hours per year, that boils down to a required capacity of 1,400 gigawatt to cover this end energy use by renewable energy only. If you cross-compare this need, 1,400, with the actually installed capacity, we fall quite short. At the moment, Germany has around 112 gigawatt, again, at the moment refers to 2017, and this after, say, 2 decades of very massive subsidies for renewables. In addition, if you take stock of viable sites, which can be still somehow cost effective, the upper capacity limit for solar and wind is estimated to be 500 gigawatt. So it's clear, if you don't think about massive exports, imports, say solar plants in the desert and lots of imports of renewables, there need to be a massive effort in terms of energy efficiency improvements and in terms of energy savings. And all these 3 dimensions now, which would not be the 3 Ds I mentioned before, but now is the 3 E's in Germany at least. It's the renewable energy, it's energy savings, and energy efficiency need to be coordinated somehow. And here is where digitalization comes into place. Digitalization can render the energy system, as I will lay out later on, smarter and provide a cost-effective means to coordinate energy savings, energy efficiency, and renewable energy expansion. So if we phrase now another formula, at least a mathematical program, I'm sorry. If we phrased that challenge of how to coordinate energy efficiency improvements, energy savings in an efficient manner, and efficient means now cost effective, then we could simply write down, and that would be the engineer's perspective, a mathematical program where we say, okay, we need to deliver a certain amount of energy services, which is an objective function, and we need to do that taking into account environmental constraints, which is the carbon emission constraint, and also energy supply security constraints. And just by solving this, in this case, linear program, we would get what a system operator would call economic dispatch. So we get the merit order, and we dispatch energy in a cost-effective manner along the merit order. That's now just an illustration for operation of existing power plants, but of course, in a dynamic perspective, you will also include expansion via new capacities. The economist perspective would be, we don't need engineers to solve that problem. We can let markets work. And going back to the fundamentals of microeconomics, the first welfare theorem, the belief would be that as we get competitive markets, we can actually provide energy service in a cost-effective manner, simply by what you call maximizing economic surplus as the sum of consumer and producer surplus, or put it differently, we have rational agents that trade off the marginal cost of their action with the marginal benefit, and as they do so, the market equilibrium, the intersection of supply and demand, will secure allocative efficiency. Yet in that solution, we have not taken into account the side constraints that I presented you one slide before. So it's clear that regulation to some extent has to come into game, And regulation in this case would require to have a carbon emission constraint, meaning to put economic incentives to reduce carbon by a system of tradable permits or by implementing a carbon tax. And to the extent that private markets can't assure a socially desirable level of energy security, we would give incentives to the markets to provide, in addition, energy supply security services. Before I get a little bit deeper in smartness of regulation based on digitalization, let me first discuss digital innovation as a driving force for energy system transformation. So broadly speaking, innovation is at the heart of an economy, of a dynamic economy, by providing productivity gains and economic growth in the mid to long term. By innovation, the entrepreneur obtains a competitive edge, to some extent a temporary monopoly situation, and he can maintain this monopoly until there are imitators or there are competitors that have a superseding innovation. In reference to Schumpeter, innovation is ambiguously characterized as creative destruction. So you also see, if I go on here, so you also see the Janus hat, which basically characterizes this ambiguity. So new products, markets, and value chains are created while the business of incumbent stakeholders might be destroyed. A popular example for that, already 100 years old, is this technology race between horses and cars, and at the end, not the faster horses, as Henry Ford puts it, not the faster horses succeeded, but the thin lissies, or tin lissies. And we might see a similar game now as we discuss the competition between internal combustion engines based on gasoline and diesel versus electrical vehicles. Digitalization. Is it just a buzzword, or is it a necessity, a bare necessity, as we would put it in the Jungle Book? Is it a bare necessity for business to survive? I'm not an expert in innovation, so I just take an anecdotal evidence from Kodak, the so-called Kodak moment, which illustrates the innovator's dilemma. So you might know, at least the older people among us, that Kodak was the leading firm in camera sales. And as you can see, it lasted quite a long time until the 2001. And meanwhile, Kodak is off. And the reason is that Kodak missed the innovation to go from analog to digital cameras. The innovator's dilemma here in particular refers to the fact that already in 1975, the engineers of the physics, we have physics students here, they basically developed the digital camera. So Kodak was the first firm that had digital cameras, but there were the business people in the company were afraid to cannibalize their own business. So they're basically for more of catering customers' current needs than thinking about future needs and addressing these future concerns of the market. And in the end, then, we know that Kodak is history. So if we talk about digitalization, what are the main drivers? So if you look for questionnaires, you do empirical research, there are three reasons that are mentioned here, three key reasons. One are customers' expectations. The second one is competitive pressure. So you have to use digital technologies to cut down cost. And the third one, which may be a little bit undersold, are new challenges, new chances for business models, mainly based on large data as the so-called new gold or oil of the economy. In particular, digitalization allows for the cheap processing of big data where the embodied information carries economic value. So big data you have characterized by V to the power of 3, volume, velocity, variety. I put a fourth inside, the value. And for your own serious entertainment, you could visit the Financial Times website and get information on your own values, for example, by quoting your age, gender, mailing address, education level, or if you happen to be not really healthy, probably the more sick you are, the more valuable your data is. So this is just an illustration on how multiplied by a big population, big data then creates value, which needs to be taken into account if you think about future digital business models. Moreover, this coordination of big data via platforms at very, very low cost has essentially this option or this chance to be a game changer in terms of radical innovations. So what we see here is just a selection of emergence of dominating platforms which changed previous business models. So Uber is the biggest taxi company, owns no cars. Facebook is the most valuable media company. You know about the plans from the news yesterday. They want to even merge their previously separate platforms. Produces no contents. Alibaba is the most valuable trader, owns no merchandises. Airbnb is the biggest vendor of accommodation, owns no properties. So this gives an illustration about the radical innovation which could also happen in the energy system. So if we look into the energy system, many energy system experts say, well, ICT, innovation communication technology, is nothing new. To some extent, we used that in the past, that's true, but with the new digital technologies which make data processing very, very cheap, we enter a new age. And so what you will see increasingly is that ICT enters the value chain in any element from generation to retail and may even cut down some segments. So if I start with the retail, we could foresee a future where we no longer have the actual retail market, but we use automated blockchain to do peer-to-peer trading between prosumers and consumers simultaneously. Clearly then, if we think about smart meters, we will discuss later on, we can also use that in grid operation. We couldn't use, as I will point out in a second, artificial intelligence, machine learning to increase the predictive power in the electricity grid usage, but also in renewable power generation, say predictions for solar and wind. So this is essentially what I put together here. If we think about more advanced digital technologies, say artificial intelligence and machine learning, they will be used for increased automation. Blockchain technologies can be used for secure, decentralized peer-to-peer transactions. The Internet of Things is discussed for connecting smart appliances, electronics, mobile devices, and sensors. And in the box, you just have a couple of recent research applications. And you can also see that there are companies in there which didn't have anything to do with the traditional energy business. So we quote here Google with the DeepMind team, which is basically last year we visited Google and we could have some smell on their business strategy, talking also about antitrust policies with Halvarian, which makes his pension money now as a protagonist of Google's interests. But you know, this illustrates their digital technologies could go. So National Grid We have some people from the UK here, already partners up with DeepMind team, and wants to do that for cost reduction of grid operation. The university I am with is relatively well established in photovoltaics and wind. They use artificial intelligence to basically increase the accuracy of predictions on wind and solar production. So all this, as I tried to point out in the very beginning, will help to coordinate a smart energy system, which is mainly based on decentralized volatile sources, which then have to be fed in coordinatedly in the grid. The grid has, then for keeping it reliable, has to rely on digital information, metering at many places. This is now not a big thing because it's relatively cheap. The grid can communicate with storage options. The grid can communicate with possibilities to do automated energy consumption adjustments or savings with the final consumer. So there had been a bigger report by Bloomberg in 2017 on digitalization of the energy business. The numbers now may not seem too big, but you see clear growth potential here, mainly in home energy management systems, which would be with HEMS over the next years. You see also that smart meters are predicted to increase a lot. And overall, the trend is that there is a big market potential. And I try to break that down a little bit further. On the right-hand side is a survey of Bischoff et al. I think they collected literature, 200 articles with patents, with scientific citations on potential of smart metering. And again, you see in this two dimensions, target audience and smart grid added value, that there are plenty of possibilities for using digital technologies. Finally, before I come to the third part, implications for smarter regulation, let me stress again this disruptive nature that digitalization can bring along. So as I had to point out this example of Google and DeepMind cooperating with the grid company in UK, you see also that these bigger data companies invest in the energy business. So take Nest by Google as one example. And they try to monetize data. And as they then become owner of data, they could squeeze the incumbent supplier out of the market, or they could relegate these previously dominant players to an inferior role. So just think of a future where the core product as is, electricity, is just a byproduct, maybe at 0 cents. We sell it at 0 cents because the physical stream of electricity opens new selling streams for different products. And these new selling streams create enough money to just give off electricity for free. It doesn't happen so much, but I had one example here based on artificial intelligence and machine learning. So the algorithm just captures how many times you have to wash your washing machine until you run down your stock of detergents. And then the detergent company basically automatically fills up, like Nespresso, by sending you the powder. And if the detergent is expensive enough, you may just give electricity as a byproduct for free. How realistic that is, we will see in a couple of years from now. I don't have that for the time being at home, but I think it's something people in the energy business that met yesterday as well should take into account. So let me now come to the third part, which are the implications of digitalization of the energy system, which we would call then a smart energy system. What are the implications for regulation? And again, I go back to the very principles. So the advantage of a keynote sometimes is to keep very broad, hopefully not too shallow. So in a nutshell, smart regulation, before we go to smarter regulation, just means you cure what the market cannot deliver. And okay, the market cannot deliver a self-curement of market failures. And I just had like 4 dimensions of market failures you are all familiar with. And the challenge for smart regulation would then be to pick among policy instruments that is targeted for the specific disease, for the specific market imperfection, and to dose it in a correct way. So again, you see here on the right-hand side, this is a survey by Gillingham and Sweeney on how digitalization can affect energy market regulation, already written a couple of years ago. Lots of possible instruments. And now the question is, if we go back to what I phrased as the major D, the principal D, decarbonization of the energy system, are we already at the point where we can talk about smart regulation before we go to smarter regulation? And my answer would be no. We are even not yet smart. It's always easy as an academic to say politicians are dumb. Because they don't really run a very, very simple mathematical program. And on the other hand, I think you still should pinpoint to major principles. And as I pointed out, the major principle is, well, what is the market failure and what is the instrument to cure that? And in the dimension of decarbonization, it's clear with CO2 externality, which then by textbook economics, which would call for a single economy-wide CO2 price, which actually reflects the social cost of carbon. If we take this metric for smart regulation and we look what is done in many EU countries, but also outside the EU, we can get depressed. What we see is CO2 prices are too low. They are fragmented across sectors and they are incoherent across fuels. So take the current EU ETS price, which is the upper left here in the chart. Yes, we see that with the market stability reserve and backloading, the CO2 price went up. It's no longer below 10 euros per ton of carbon, roughly 20 at the moment. I didn't check the price this morning. You can do that online. But taking decent social discount rates, we are far off, say, from 43 with a discount rate of 3%, or $43 per ton of carbon. Also, we know that the CO2 price only applies to a certain segment of the economy, which roughly covers 50% of emissions, and the remainder is still not covered by a coherent price signal. If we then think about sector coupling, and we talk about how these new technologies, power to heat, power to mobility, can enter the market, then the most serious impediment is the discrimination across fuels. So if we take as a very simple back on the envelope calculation fees and taxes that are levied on different fuels, we see that the implicit CO2 price for electricity is in Germany, 185 euros per ton, whereas heating oil is taxed at 8 euros per ton, which makes clear that if we want to electrify the home system, replacing oil or gas boilers with heat pumps, then there is a huge disadvantage for electricity. And that's commonly, I do now, or we have a chapter, we will hand that over to the Chancellor, Merkel. In 2 weeks from now, we have a chapter on the energy transition, on impediments for innovations there. So the common perspective of experts is that incoherent pricing of energy fuels with respect to the carbon externality is the major impediment. So it's not like asymmetric information, it's not R&D spillover effects that we should really, in first place, internalize. It's about correct CO2 pricing. Still, on the way from becoming smart, not even smarter, is in addition to a carbon price which is too low, which is fragmented, and which is not reflected in the fuels, maybe because this is the case, we have lots of other instruments. And so going with Tinbergen, whom you see with the picture down there, every pot has a lid. So if we have one externality, we should stick and try to pick one instrument. If we have multiple instruments that go at the same problem, we run this challenge of overlapping counterproductive regulation, which we see now in terms of additional energy efficiency targets, additional renewable promotion policies. At the point they become binding, they actually cause excess cost. If we keep with this small metric and say, well, the main challenge is the CO2 externality. Okay, so just a couple of slides, and when I'm done, I think 3 or 4 more slides. So first thing first means get CO2 prices right and get rid of overlapping counterproductive regulation. Let markets work and not bureaucrats. Now, what's the value added from digitalization? How could we come from smart to smarter? Well, we look at the smart energy system, how I try to sketch it. So it's a system with very decentralized, distributed energy resources. We have technologies, tools for measurement, reporting, and verification, and we see new models, business models, mainly relying on big data. So the first thing would be, in terms of what is smarter regulation, to take a step back. As you get your submitted paper to a journal back with a revise and resubmit, the R&R, you take a reality check and you go on the existing policy and you ask yourself to what extent is the digital transformation captured in this existing policy framework. And I just illustrated a source by EC map on how they do that or did that in the US at the federal level and at the state level. And the same could happen here at the national level, at the subnational level, at the EU national level. And so the reality check should include that you need to think about this decentralized nature of the energy system, how to promote sector coupling, and how to actually account for flexibility options. The smarter regulation should then try to promote digital innovation. As I pointed out, with the incoherent CO2 pricing, you rather avoid, you hinder new digital innovations rather than promoting it. And of course, you need to hedge against the risk of a digital economy. I try to bring up more substance in that last section. Well, before I go to that, hedging against the risk of digital economy, let me just point out 2 lines for smarter regulation. So as I try to make clear with these tools for monitoring, reporting, verification, more precisely smart meterings, we can reduce transaction costs. So we can refine policies to become much more granulate than they had been before. The blockchain technology, as another example, allows you to reduce information asymmetries. So this taken together allows you to set up more targeted and responsive policies. You have a better market control. For example, you can better check monopoly pricing in markets than you used to do that before. You have a way how to check how effective policies are enforced, and that basically relates you to the possibility of what you call more evidence-based regulation. These 2 examples, blockchain on the right hand and network charges, which is no longer a post-stamp fee because of the transaction costs that were involved before. Now you can think about locational marginal pricing, where you signal with relatively little additional cost, the true cost for a user to take use of the network at a certain point in time and at a certain location. So clearly, again, I was with Orwell, I was saying the brave new green world. Now let's be also cautious here and not say the brave new digital world or smart world. There are also downsides, but these downsides are not restricted to the energy economy. The question is, what is the digital transformation doing in general to the economy, and how are different market failures, how are they enhanced, or maybe they are alleviated? So you could think about this potential of platforms that make unduly use of network effects, and that could lead to an increase in market power. The opposite would be, you say, well, I can better monitor, and maybe then competition can be better verified. Clearly, as we create lots of data which has a value, so I know now that Maite went up 5 to 8, she brushed her teeth, she had a tea rather than a coffee, and so on and so forth. So then the question is, who owns the data? Is she owning the data? What is her right if she wants to quit a supplier, to take the data, bring it to a new supplier in order to avoid these login effects? It's also the question of data privacy. We need to think about, in terms of energy security, who at the end remains liable for energy security in a very decentralized market. How could we protect the electricity system in terms of cybersecurity? A very important thing in digitalization is to define common standards, rules for interoperability, and that has to be secured not only within Spain, but as we have somehow a copper plate, somehow across EU member states. So that brings me to my conclusions. With multiple triangles here. So do we need smarter regulation? I would say in first place we need smart regulation, which has not too much to do with the digitalization, with a smart energy system. It simply means, okay, we are faced with decarbonization, so get first things first right, and this means try to do coherent CO2 pricing and get rid of counterproductive overlapping regulation. So this is something which is in the literature for years, for decades, but it's still something which you should, as a student, you can actually find lots of instances of counterproductive overlapping regulation, which I have to admit is part political economy, so you need to be careful about trade-offs, but it's still something from an economic discipline that needs to be addressed and criticized. And then as we proceed with the new chances of digitalization, policy regulation should actually be revised and adapted in terms of data privacy, data liability, and so on and so forth, standards to enable digital innovations, to basically enable digital startups in the energy business rather than protecting incumbent firms. I think a very interesting issue is that it's not only a chance and a risk for the energy business itself, but for regulation. Digital government, e-government in this case, would say e-regulation, because you can use smart metering for actually verifying how good and effective your policies are, to what extent there is market concentration, and so on and so forth. So clearly, as I pointed out, you have to hedge against digital economy risks. Now let me end with a caveat. So even smarter regulation, if you follow the policy debate, say in Germany or in France, smarter regulation may not work if it doesn't include smart compensation. So I like this sequence of pictures here. At the top we have Thomas Edison, 1880, who says, we will make electricity so cheap that only the rich will burn candles. Brave new world. And then I got this cartoon where a son sits together with a father, can't we afford the electric debt? And the father says, no, I'm sorry, we can't afford. We have too high green taxes. So pointing to this situation that we really can't go back to the past, not back to the future, back to the past. So we need to think about, when we do smarter regulation in a very sensible area like energy, which is a basic need, that we have to protect the vulnerable parts of a society without really reducing the effectiveness, say, of carbon pricing policies. Otherwise, we get a situation like we had in, or still have in France, rien ne va plus. And with that outlook, I would like to end my talk, and I thank you for your attention.
With the permission of the first table, we are going to drop in 5 minutes. It's not possible, okay? No? 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 Yes? Well, with the permission of the first table, we are going to use 5 minutes of that.
So I exceeded my time.
No,
Okay.
don't worry. You must be Danny David, please. Some questions.
Yeah. Good morning.
Okay, thank you.
My name is Francesc Bombay. I am an engineer, so my question will come from this side. Thank you very much for your insights into the whole energy world. And it's rather simple. My question is about, can you elaborate further on the concept of energy savings? I am not very comfortable with this concept, and can you sort it out, especially in front of energy efficiency? Thank you.
Yeah, I can briefly answer. So I have to say this is something which I sometimes have to discuss with engineers, and they really insist that there is a distinction between energy efficiency improvements and energy savings. And so the distinction is you have a certain level of energy services, like a heated room, and the energy efficiency improvement is that you need less primary energy to get the same temperature in the room per square meter, and energy savings would simply say, well, I don't heat the room as much. So I would say the energy savings dimension, which I also put a little bit more in the technology sphere, is more behavioral. But clearly, you know, we need, as I try to point out, we need to have energy savings coupled with energy efficiency improvements and renewable expansion from the future system to be decarbonized.
Thank you. Danny Davi, another question, because I prefer, it's better for us, for the first table time, to pose all the questions now. After Jordi, another? No? Two only. Danny.
Yes, okay. Congratulations for your presentation. It has been a very good side of the sector. I have one question, because you have mentioned that it's necessary to make grid extensions in transmission and distribution grids. And yesterday we saw, not only in Europe, also in Latin America, that it's very difficult, much more difficult building new grids, because society is worried about that. We have environmental awareness. Therefore, some people say that investment in grids is not only in extension, but also in digitalization, in improving the operation of the assets. So what have you mentioned, or what do you have in mind to say we need more grid extension? Thank you.
Jordi, and you answer all the questions. Jordi Paniagua from Valencia University.
Okay. Thank you very much for your enlightenment. I just want to ask you from
No, Jordi, it's not possible to hear you.
Hello?
No, higher. No se
Hi. Thank you very much for your enlightening talk. I just want to ask you, because you focused on the last part of the carbon identity, but I want to ask you if you could spare some words saying how does the digitalization and also the increasing role of intangibles in the economy also could act on the GDP per capita that you said at the beginning, no? So we always take for granted that GDP per capita will increase also the carbon, but in the new digital economy, which has an increasing role of intangibles, that might not be the case in the following years, no? So we could have a reinforcement mechanism of the digital economy, maybe not so focused on the energy efficiency, but also on a new way to approach the GDP per capita. Thank you.
Okay. So I start with a quick question. You know, in a first round, we need the grid expansion if we think about unequal distribution of sources of generation, say North Germany with wind and South Germany with industry. So we need to feed in and transport. And because of the nature of electricity, if we can't store, then you know, we need more transmission facilities. So I think in an optimized system, the role of storage plays a role, the role of demand-side management, which we had for decades. In the 1980s, I worked on demand-side management already. This is all becoming an issue. You pointed to this political resistance, which is true. I think Andreas is in the commission for monitoring the energy transition in Germany, so he might be much aware of this protest and resistance. At the moment, if I recall correctly, we have changes in the law to enforce quicker transmission line building, but as I try to point out with my slides on the capacity on renewable, which is limited and by far off what we would need, it's the same thing with transmission capacity. So in Germany, we are far behind the schedule, which is in part because of your correct observation that people are worried. You could bring the transmission lines into the earth, that would somehow reduce resistance, but it's much more expensive. Other options is to basically include people and say they can profit as shareholders from transmission line. So that's another issue. But I think I don't want to overplay transmission expansion in the distribution or transmission grid, but it need to be done, at least in Germany, at a much bigger scale and at a quicker speed. I'm not sure how it is in Spain, but I would say similar problems, and also with interconnectors between the countries. Then this other issue was, if I correctly understand, was it's a broader perspective on what constitutes the future wealth of a society. If we go more into a digital economy, as you say, with more intangibles, you know, the question is, what is intangible? As I said before, we create surely big data streams, and we see, if you do the market valuation of this network companies, the platform companies, they have data assets, data values, which exceed like physical value of a car company like Mercedes-Benz by 10 times. And so I think the key issue here is also that who owns the data. And I think that's a challenge, not only in the energy business, in all parts of the economy, as we move more from say, the classical world to an Internet of Things. Is that somehow at least the right correction, or the right direction, sorry.
Thank you, Chris, for your very interesting conference. We are going to have the first table. Thank you.
Yeah,
very much.
thank you again.